Good evening, at least it's evening here for us in Washington, D.C. tonight. Welcome to our Teach 250 series, our second session. Boy, it's going to be tough to top the last one. If any of you were able to join us with our friends from Independence National Historical Park, they put on quite a show for us last time. But we're excited today to be back. I'm with my colleague, Bethany. She's the brains behind this one. We're going to look at the National Mall as America's civic stage. So we're hoping you all will join in a little bit in the conversation. I know it's not a real conversation as far as being able to talk very much, but please use the chat box. In fact, introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from. And if you have any questions along the way, comments, we're really looking to try and engage you as much as we can, answer any questions or share any ideas. I will keep an eye on the chat, and Ranger Bethany is here to kind of lead our conversation about some of the different events that have happened. Okay, Pennsylvania's in the house, yay. So as always, we're able to offer up these programs thanks to our friends at the Trust for the National Mall. We really appreciate their help in coordinating and setting up these programs. And yeah, so I guess we're about ready to get started. Bethany,
welcome everyone. Thank you. My name is Ranger Bethany. I'm a park ranger here on the National Mall. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this park is that there are so many different uses of the National Mall. People come from all over the country for various reasons, whether it's to celebrate or demonstrate or commemorate. We also have sort of this this recreation legacy attached to the National Mall as well. So it's a very well-used, well-loved park. In case you're not familiar with the National Mall, this is a great picture. The mall itself looks beautiful here. One of the things that we quite often get, though, especially when we're working with students, is that people are often confused by our name. And if we sort of think of the definition of the word mall today, most of the time we think about shopping. And of course, the National Mall is a little bit of a different type of mall. And if we sort of transport ourselves back 100, 150 years ago, the definition of the word mall was really sort of this open public park, this space where people could gather. Quite often it had shaded walkways. And so that's how we really got our name. And the National Mall was kind of created right along with the city itself. And again, over the course of its history, it's changed, it's evolved, it's looked a little different here and there. At one point, it had a railroad track go across it. But it's always been a gathering place. It's always been, in many ways, a public forum. And anybody want to take a guess as to where this picture may have been taken?
I was going to say, having been out there today, it kind of looks a little like it did today. We had such a beautiful day.
Did.
We had a few guesses of the Washington Monument.
Yeah, so this was taken to the top of the Washington Monument. And if we sort of look at the view from the other side, from behind the Lincoln Memorial, looking out towards the Washington Monument, here's sort of the extension of the National Mall. And one of the things that I find kind of interesting when we talk about how the park has been used as a civic stage, we really sort of see this evolution of how these events, of where they take place and how they take place. Many of the traditional demonstrations, protests, marches that we had here in Washington, D.C. ran down Pennsylvania Avenue, sort of that iconic roadway between the White House and the U.S. Capitol building. And it's this sort of idea, of going down that road between these two very important buildings, the executive branch, the legislative branch. And then as time goes by and sort of the mall itself evolves and changes, we see a little bit of a difference in where a lot of these events start to take place. And we'll talk a little bit about that as the presentation goes on a little bit today. But I wanted to start with a question to see what you all thought about why are some events successful, why others make less of an impact. Any thoughts as to maybe what goes into a successful event? Or can you maybe think of one that's happened in Washington, that's happened on the National Mall that you would consider a success? And what made it a success?
Interesting. The first comment we have is media coverage,
Oh, yep.
location, passion, word of mouth.
Interesting. Okay. Yep, I will definitely agree that the coverage of it, is very important. And, sometimes the events that we have in Washington, are simply just to raise awareness, just to get the message out, to get the energy, sort of building around, the event or the idea, while others are used to try and change policy.
A lot of planning before the event. I mean, I think of one that we consider successful involved a lot of planning.
Yes.
The work doesn't stop with the demonstration. It's all in the follow-up, which doesn't get the headlines.
Interesting. Yep, agreed. Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't mention it before, but the National Mall has roughly 4,000 permanent events each and every year. And over half of those permanent events are considered First Amendment demonstrations. Even the National Park Service, if we wish to hold an event somewhere in the park, say the Cherry Blossom Festival, the 4th of July, if we want to have an anniversary, a commemoration of some sort, we too are held to the permit process. And so we have to apply for a permit. And basically, one of the reasons that we use the permit process is that it kind of reserves that space for the group, that wishes to come in and do something. It also allows us to utilize the space wisely. So if we've got 3 different groups that want to come in on a specific day, say it's an important anniversary of something, we can coordinate that a little bit better than simply saying, yes, come in and come and have your event. There are all kinds of different rules and regulations that, that go along with the permitting process. You can apply for an event up to a year, but we need at least 48-hour notice. And so, we'll work with you as best we can. Usually if a permit is going to be denied, it's simply because the space isn't available. There's another group that has taken that area. And one of the things that I wanted to show you that kind of goes along with this question and with some of the things that you shared are maybe 3 events that have taken place on the National Mall that you can talk about and sort of discuss with students as to maybe why they were successful and why they made less of an impact. And the first one I wanted to share with you is a march that was referred to as Coxey's Army. It occurred in 1894, and it's widely considered to be one of the first massive march on Washington, D.C. And it kind of comes on the heels of the Panic of 1893. Which led to a severe economic depression, lots and lots of unemployment. There really weren't many safety nets around at that time. And so people were becoming relatively desperate. And Joseph Coxey was a 39-year-old businessman from Ohio who kind of came up with this plan. And it was kind of, pretty daring at the time. This has really never been tried before. The whole idea is that a group of unemployed workers would march to Washington, D.C., go to the steps of the U.S. Capitol building and present a plan, which was kind of known as the Good Roads Plan. And so basically the whole idea is that the federal government would hire these workers, these unemployed workers, to help build and fix roadways throughout the United States. And it's kind of an interesting thought process, especially at this time. You have a group of individuals marching over 700 miles to Washington, D.C. to present this plan. It takes them many, many days to get here. They're camping throughout their journey. There are some cities that are not allowing the marchers to even come into the city proper because there's a lot of confusion. There's some anxiety associated with all of these people marching to Washington, D.C. Again, this is really the first time this had ever happened. By May 1st, the Army had reached Washington. They had camped the night before in Rock Creek Park, if you're familiar with the area. It's just kind of, it's really nearby Washington, D.C., another park that we have here. And thousands of people actually turn out simply to see what happened. This had captivated the country. It was all that was really being talked about in the newspapers. And it was one of these situations where, depending upon the newspapers, how this march was being reported. By the time they get to Washington, D.C., there's some anxiety surrounding this event. When Coxey and his co-organizers get to the steps of the Capitol building, the goal is to simply read their plan, to read their plan out loud. Does anybody know how this march ends? Has anybody heard of this event before?
New to me, somebody said.
Yeah,
Samantha's not familiar with it. Yep.
new as well.
Never heard it before. That's 3.
So it actually ends, and kind of consider this, it's for many of these individuals, it's a 700-mile march, and it ends in 15 minutes. Basically, what happens is that city officials use this sort of long lost DC law that makes it illegal to gather or step on the lawn of the US Capitol. And so when Coxey and his co-organizers reach the Capitol building, they're almost immediately arrested, and the crowd is forced to disperse. And Coxey never gets to present his plan to the Capitol. They're kept in jail for a few days, and eventually this whole idea, this whole march simply kind of falls apart. The interesting part of the story is, though, on May 1st of 1944, so many years later, Coxey is invited back to Washington, D.C., where he's allowed to finally read his plan on the Capitol steps. And one of the reasons that he gets to do this is that a lot of what he was talking about, a lot of the information or the goal of the plan was very much in line with President Roosevelt's New Deal programs. So it's kind of an early version of that. But here's a great example of something that was planned. There was a plan in place. There was a march, hundreds of marchers, hundreds of unemployed workers make their way to Washington, D.C. And yet in 15 minutes, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And I think part of the reason why that happens was, again, this had never been tried before. This was something new, and there was a lot of anxiety among city officials as to what exactly was going to happen once this group reached the nation's capital. So here's kind of a great example of, a march that didn't really have much of an impact, on getting change or getting things changed in Washington. Another example of there's Coxey being arrested very shortly after he reaches the Capitol steps there. Another kind of interesting march, certainly to talk about, was the women's suffrage procession of 1913. And this comes on the heels of President Wilson's inauguration. And this happens the day before. And this day was specifically chosen to sort of raise awareness about the idea that women couldn't legally vote in many states and territories in the United States. And they really wanted to show the country and the world that women had, rights as citizens to express their political opinions through voting. And so this whole idea was simply, in many ways, to raise awareness and to sort of build on all of this excitement and energy associated with an inauguration. One of the things that's kind of interesting, again, about this march is that it was very organized. There were a number of groups involved, and the whole idea was the procession was organized to feature accomplishment and important contributions women made, and not only to the nation, but also around the world. Marchers were grouped together by home state or by organization. or even by academic organizations. There were even, if you take a look at the picture kind of in the top right corner here, there was representatives from groups all throughout the world associated with the march here. They carried banners, they rode on floats, bands played patriotic songs, and the whole procession was designed to impress the spectators, excuse me, but also to present their own argument. And one of the things that's really interesting about this march is that it wasn't the first march for suffrage. It wasn't even the largest. But one of the things that it does is it kind of shows this sort of evolution in the thought process with this whole movement. And it kind of goes away from this idea of sort of doing it piecemeal and trying to get suffrage, for different jurisdictions or different states. The idea for this march is to raise awareness and to sort of bring energy around this idea of a constitutional amendment that ultimately will provide, voting rights for women in the United States. And so no longer going to do it, one state, one locality at a time. We want an amendment that covers the entire United States. And so this march was really to sort of show the evolution in many ways of that thought process and to bring energy surrounding this new idea of an amendment. And this isn't something that has success right away. It would be another 7 years before the amendment is ultimately ratified. But here's an example of a march that didn't necessarily bring immediate change or wasn't immediately successful, but it starts this new energy surrounding this movement. That ultimately will provide the sort of the force that was needed to pass this amendment. So here's an example of, we have two examples, one that didn't really generate any change and one that would generate change within the future. And then there's another example, one that often isn't talked about, unfortunately, a lot here in the park. Here's just another example of the crowd sort of trying to sort of block perhaps the march. Eventually this crowd would be moved out of the way. And here are the women making their way up to the Capitol, where Coxie isn't allowed really to go up to the steps. Here we see sort of a different approach to that. So they do make their way up the Capitol steps there. But another march that you can definitely present to your students, or a protest, I guess, if you will, that you could present to your students, is associated with the East Potomac Park Golf Course, which opened in 1920. If anybody is from the local area, this is often referred to as Haynes Point. And this was one of 8 public golf courses that the federal government built during what kind of was considered to be the golden era of golf, which was really 1910 to about 1950. Now, within that time frame, 4 of the 6 courses that opened right before World War II were historically reserved for white golfers. And so many of the recreational spaces that we have here in Washington, even within the national park itself, were historically segregated. Now, there were many leaders within Washington, D.C. That objected to this. The whole idea about building these recreational spaces was really that parks should be places where everyone could play sports and spend time outdoors for both health and enjoyment. And yet here, even in the early days, we see them following, this idea of segregation. And so through some protests, through writing, through objecting of this, 2 golf courses will eventually open that will allow Black golfers to play. One of those is Langston Golf Course, which is in Anacostia, which opened in the late 1930s. And it's one of the 3 golf courses that's still open today. The other is this one here, and then there's also one in Rock Creek. The other golf course that I don't think a lot of people realize existed was the Lincoln Memorial Golf Course, which was opened between 1924 and 1939. And this course opened simply because a lot of Black golfers protested this idea that they really didn't have a place to play golf. Now, if you take a look at the course itself, what do you notice? And the golf course is this right here. And I'm going to show this picture again. The East Potomac Golf Course is this one right here. And compare it to this golf course right here. What are some differences that you notice?
Much smaller.
Yeah, it's only 9 holes, where the other essentially would be a 118-hole golf course and then 2 9-hole courses, 9-hole courses. So definitely much smaller.
It doesn't look as well landscaped.
Yep. So it's the condition is very noticeably worse, especially than what we saw at East Potomac.
Doesn't really look like a golf course.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people surprised that it was there in the first place. And conditions would actually get worse as Arlington Memorial Bridge is the bridge you kind of see over here in the right-hand corner there. As that bridge is being built, the builders just start to pile things onto the Lincoln Memorial Golf Course. And it gets to the point where the whole course itself essentially is one hole. But it was a very, very popular course. Within the first 3 months of its existence, over 1,000 rounds of golf were played. And so it is a very popular thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't kept up like the other courses were. And this is also going to cause different golfers and leaders within Washington to file formal protests. And when that doesn't seem to be having much of an impact, there are 3 golfers that decide to take matters into their own hands. And on June 29th of 1941, these 3 Black golfers, whose names are Asa Williams, George Williams, and Cecil R. Shamwell, arrive at East Potomac Park with every intention of playing a full 18 rounds. Now, initially, they are turned away, but they do come back slightly later in the day and simply walk onto the course and decide to play golf. Eventually, park police officers are dispatched to the areas. They don't stop these 3 golfers. They simply follow them, making sure that they can safely finish the round. And these 3 will play a full round of golf. And essentially what this does is this almost overnight creates change. The Secretary of Interior at the time was a man by the name of Harold Ickes. It's a great name. We'll probably say his name a little bit later on. He had been trying to open up many of the recreational spaces within Washington, D.C. to everyone, and he's really not achieving this. But on the very next day, he essentially says that all recreational opportunities within Washington, D.C. Are fully open to everyone. And so here we see these 3 golfers simply come and play the sport they love and almost immediately make change. And this also has a larger impact because by 1945, Harold Ickes has essentially opened up the entire National Park Service and sort of integrates all areas. And so again, here we see another example of 3 individuals making major change almost overnight. And so if you compare Coxey's army to the suffrage procession to the protest at the East Potomac Golf Course, you can see kind of 3 different examples of some of the events that have taken place on the National Mall, 3 different outcomes. And this one, in many ways, wasn't necessarily even planned. It was just ideas that we're going to go down there, we're going to play golf, and we're going to see what happens. And it's a very successful event. And so again, a couple of different, events that you could present to your students to see what their thoughts are on how these became successful or how they had, maybe not so much in the way of impacts. Anybody have any thoughts or questions thus far?
I had a thought while I've been listening to some of this, and I'm kind of curious from the teacher perspective. Do stories like these have impacts? Do you think that this is by sharing stories like this, is it a way to you know, maybe promote activism amongst your students, or would students feel inspired to want to do anything, or, you know, make change themselves, or see themselves in these kinds of actions? I wonder if you've had experiences talking about demonstrations and things like this. I think personal stories have the most impact. They relate to the people. Yeah, I think that's the cases that we find too, and the stories that we share about the people. And they're the things you remember because you remember the people. Yeah, y'all are typing too fast for me. Wow. They love learning about new topics like these, especially when they can see themselves in the protesters. That's kind of cool to think about. I love hearing them. My second graders love stories too, and it sticks with them better than just facts. Cool. Thank you all.
Yeah, definitely agree. All right. So I have another question for you. And maybe this picture gives it away a little bit. Can a march or demonstration transform the meaning of a memorial? And can you think of an instance, maybe, you know, even here on the National Mall or somewhere where perhaps you are, where this has happened? Well, we can definitely give you an example of how this is truly happened here on the National Mall at probably one of our most visited spaces here in the park. And I'm sure it's an area that you are going to recognize. I'm sure you all recognize this individual right here. And I think we did have something pop up in the chat. Jen, did you want to?
Yeah, no, people are just saying that history layers on top of things, places, and most definitely changes the meaning. And that these stories show a more human side. There's an anyone can do this element that students can connect with. And then somebody mentioned the I Have a Dream speech, which I think is maybe where you're headed.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
I hope you're gonna mention the inscription here, because that's a fun story too.
Yeah. So I think even before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which brought Dr. King and other civil rights leaders to the Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King gives his very important I Have a Dream speech. I think the Lincoln Memorial's connection to the civil rights movement actually began on the day that it was dedicated. And this is definitely one of my favorite stories associated with this memorial. And if you look at the inscription that's right above Abraham Lincoln's head there, this is kind of it was referred to as the epitaph. It's kind of the thematic statement. The builders really wanted visitors who came into the memorial to kind of give a summary as to why this place was created. And if you look at that inscription, do you see anything that might be missing? If this is a memorial dedicated to Lincoln's legacy.
This reminds me, I can share some of our resources about this memorial too.
Yes. Yeah.
Throw those in the chat here in just a second.
Yeah, so the inscription in this temple is in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. So a lot of times when we present this inscriptions to students, we often ask them, you know, what part of Abraham Lincoln's legacy is missing from this thematic statement. And of course, one of the things that they'll often tell us is this idea of emancipation or freedom. And unfortunately, it was intentionally left off the inscription. It was created by an art critic whose name I always mispronounce. I'll tell you that right now. Royal Cortazos was asked to write this inscription. And in doing so, he wanted to create something that was simple, easy to remember, and something that all people could identify with. But he didn't want to create something that he said would rub salt into old wounds. And so he intentionally leaves this idea of emancipation out of this inscription. And I see we've got some chats going pretty fast on there. And one of the things that I think might be interesting to have students do is to rewrite this inscription. In 2024, what would your theme statement be? Your epitaph for the Lincoln Memorial be there on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial. It's absolutely, important to talk about, his ideas about the Union and the idea that our strength comes through being sort of together. But I think there are some other things that certainly could be within that inscription even today. But, when we kind of take ourselves back to when this memorial is being built, when this memorial is being dedicated in the 1914 to 1922, things were a little bit different. And that's certainly going to play out. And we're going to definitely notice that on the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, which took place on Memorial Day in 1922. And I think one of the things that many people find kind of shocking to some degree is that this event, this ceremony, especially among the invited ticketed guests, was segregated. And there were many ticket holders, African-American ticket holders, that would make their way to this event. It generated a lot of excitement. This was going to be one of the largest events, in Washington, D.C., perhaps outside of an inauguration. It was expected that over 50,000 people would attend. It's also going to be simultaneously broadcasted on 2 different radio frequencies. And so millions more would be listening over the airways. And so this was a big event. This was the national tribute to Abraham Lincoln being dedicated here. His only surviving son, Robert, would be there. This would be the last public event that he would attend. He would die a few years later. He doesn't say anything, but just the fact that he's there to see his father's memorial dedicated generates a lot of excitement and a lot of energy. But not everybody feels that way. In fact, there are some that feel a little bit different. On that day, there are 3 keynote speakers. The President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, who is there to accept the memorial on behalf of the American people. William Howard Taft, who was Chief Justice at the time and President of the Lincoln Memorial Commission. He was there to turn the memorial over to the people on behalf of the commission. And Dr. Robert Moton, who was the president of the Tuskegee Institute. And Dr. Moton sees this as an opportunity to really plea for, in many ways, racial justice. And so if you ever have a chance, and maybe we can find it and throw it in the chat box, and I know that we could probably send it to you. Dr. Moton writes a draft speech, which the Lincoln Memorial Commission requests. They want to look at it before he actually gives the address. And when he writes this address, it's a very powerful speech. It's one that I think we could even see, being presented to the Lincoln Memorial even today. And his address meets some criticism, especially among members of the commission. And Taft will actually send him a telegraph telling him that he needs to cut out up to 500 words, especially those that were considered to be what he called propaganda. And he felt that Dr. Moton would know what he was talking about. And a lot of the propaganda that Dr. Moton removes from his speech are things that are kind of critical of the government and what's happening around the country at the time. And his speech in many ways falls in line with both what Harding and with what Taft were talking about. And again, it kind of goes along with that theme statement above Lincoln, this idea of unity and, the country coming together as a whole. So if you ever have a chance to read that draft speech, it's definitely worth taking a look at. But again, another kind of interesting thing that certainly you could ask your students is, what would you have done? I mean, Dr. Moton kind of has a choice here. He can refuse to change his address, and he can, either try to give that draft speech, or he probably knows that he will not even be allowed to speak at the dedication if he doesn't change the address, or he can change it. And one of the reasons he decides to go ahead and and change and remove some of those words. And this is one of the largest audiences that he will have an attempt or, have an opportunity to speak to. And he doesn't want to lose that chance. And he doesn't change everything, but he gets rid of a lot of the really critical language that he had in his draft speech. Now, one of the ironic things about this whole, this idea of sort of censoring what Dr. Moten says is that the very thing that he wanted to talk about happened at the dedication itself. There's one ticket holder by the name of Whitefield McKinley. And he and his wife had arrived about an hour early to get the best seats that they could. Mr. McKinley was a Washington, D.C. businessman. He was a real estate developer, and he was also appointed as one of the first African-American port collectors at the Port of Georgetown. And he is appointed to that position by William Howard Taft. And so when he arrives at the dedication, he feels that his tickets are going to have him sitting relatively close to the front of the steps, at least within view of the speakers. And he suddenly finds himself being led to the back of the event to a roped off section, which had backless benches that were sitting in weeds and high grass. And when he gets there, he's a little stunned. He's a little shocked. He's not quite sure what's happening. And then it dawns on him that he is being placed within a segregated section of the dedication. And his initial reaction is to kind of resist. In fact, his escort tells him to sit down, and he replies, "I'll think about it." Eventually, words are exchanged. It gets to be a little heated. And at the end of the day, he, his wife, and roughly 30 other African-American ticket holders decide not to even stay at this event. They decide to sort of make a stand and not allow themselves to be treated, with disrespect. And again, Washington, D.C. is segregated, but this was an outdoor event. It was the dedication of a national memorial to Abraham Lincoln. And so this was unexpected by a lot of people. And so they leave in protest and they don't stay for the event. Now, Taft, who was very involved in the organization of this, claims to be very surprised, suggests that no one at the ceremony was, given any sort of orders to segregate the ticket holders. And that really isn't good enough for many. And one of the things that we see happening is that some of the newspapers, especially the Chicago Defender, will say, because of what happened at the Lincoln Memorial that day, that the memorial may have been opened, but it was not yet dedicated. And it would not be dedicated until people went there with song and prayer and speeches that better sort of talked about the meaning behind that memorial. And I think if we look at the history of the Lincoln Memorial, I think that we can see that a lot of events that have happened there that we can certainly perhaps say, have helped to maybe dedicate and even rededicate to some degree. And we see over time sort of this evolving or changing meaning at the Lincoln Memorial. And yes, we definitely still talk about this idea of union and reunion and strength through unity. But at the memorial, we also have sort of this added meaning now. Not only we talk about Lincoln and emancipation, but we also talk about all of these sort of events, especially those associated with the civil rights movement happening at the Lincoln Memorial. It's very much become a place where people can sort of speak out against injustice in whatever form. And so it's very much taken on new meaning because of some of the things that have happened there in the early part of its history.
Folks are surprised. They don't know a lot of this story. So
Yeah.
it's really important to share. I did throw your lesson ideas from the Lincoln webpage and also the Belmont Paul women's suffrage ideas. So if folks are looking for ways to incorporate maybe some of these things into your classes. There are some using primary sources, which is something we really recommend, because then you can have students explore on their own some of these ideas. I don't know, is it one of our activities, but the idea of asking students how they would change Moten speech if they had to do that. That was an activity we had talked about at one point. Like, Taft says you have to lose so many words. How would you change it? And we do have the original and the altered version, so you can actually compare them pretty easily.
Yeah, and have them look at the draft and what would they consider to be propaganda. I mean, that's kind of an interesting word that Taft uses. And the other thing is we have all three speeches, the speech from Warren, Taft, and Dr. Moten. And it's kind of interesting to compare each of those speeches just to see what the different ideas were. And one of the things that I think Harding says, which is kind of interesting, is he talks about how this memorial was less for Abraham Lincoln than for those who would visit in the future. And in many ways, that's kind of an interesting point too of how people perceive the Lincoln Memorial even today. And when they come, how are they relating to Abraham Lincoln and how are they relating to the Lincoln Memorial? And I think there's all kinds of things you can talk about. Certainly there. This is one of Ranger Jen's and I, this is one of our favorite events that happened at the Lincoln Memorial. This is Marian Anderson, her 1939 concert. If you've never heard of Marian Anderson, you can actually go and listen to some of this concert on some of the the social media platforms. She's got a beautiful voice. All she wanted to do from the time she was a youngster was to sing. And she traveled all around the world giving these beautiful concerts, sang for dignitaries, for ambassadors, for kings and queens, and came here to Washington, D.C.
President and First Lady.
President and First Lady. Yeah, and she comes here to Washington, D.C. in the late 1930s to do a series of concerts here. But she's so famous and people love her so much that there's this really sort of struggle to find a concert venue that would hold these large crowds. And eventually it would, they were thinking of Howard, but Howard University, but didn't have, a large enough venue. And so they call up Constitution Hall, which sat about 4,000 people at the time. It was a very kind of it was the Washington, D.C. concert hall. But every time her manager called to reserve space there, he kind of gets the same answer that the space isn't available. The reason that it's not available is because, like many things in Washington, Constitution Hall was segregated and they didn't allow African-American singers, upon their stage. And so she's kind of denied entry into this building. And the Constitution Hall is run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, of which the First Lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a member. And Eleanor Roosevelt also had a My Day column where she is very, very conflicted. She hears about what's happened. She knows Marian Anderson. And she is wondering, and she presents this to her audience as to whether or not do I stay with this organization and try to change it within, or do I simply resign or leave it and try to change a different way? And ultimately, she does resign from the DAR. And again, we told you we'd bring Harold Ickes back up again. She works with Harold Ickes to try and find a place within Washington, D.C. where Marian Anderson can have her concert. And what would be a very appropriate venue, the Lincoln Memorial. And so on Easter Sunday of 1939, in front of a crowd of about 75,000 people, Marian Anderson presents this very beautiful concert. And one of the things that I very much love about this story is that Marian didn't necessarily set out to change the world. She simply wanted to use her voice, but recognized that she had an opportunity to use her voice to try and create change. And if you see her there, she'd always talked about how nervous she was. She never really, I believe, had done an outdoor concert of this type. And so when she starts to sing, she closes her eyes and then just starts to sing. And one of the things that she changes within one of her first songs, she changes it from "of thee I sing" to "of thee we sing." So she's kind of drawing the audience, drawing the crowd into this entire event as well.
I just threw Eleanor Roosevelt's resignation letter from the DAR into the chat box because it's one of my favorite primary sources. I've got a group of, I want to say, first graders that come out every year, and they do part of a public speaking event where different grades and different students come together to share speeches and songs that have kind of taken place at the Lincoln Memorial. And these first graders every year will read this letter. So it's a great idea. I mean, if you're just starting to get students involved in primary sources, it's a pretty simple letter, but she packs a punch, and she you know, she hits them where it hurts, and she said, "You all had a chance to lead, and I think you failed." And it's pretty neat. It's also fun because it's on like an old typewriter. And I think, you know, kids don't have any idea what that's about. But it's a really cool resource. I hope if you haven't read that, it'll take you 2 seconds, but it's a great way to, you know, engage students. And I'm probably not supposed to, but make a plug for the picture book When Marion Sang, which is a beautiful book if you want to introduce this story to your students of all ages, even though it's a picture book. Okay, I'll stop now.
And the DAR has a lot of good resources about the concert and about what happens. And they're very open to this idea of Marion not being allowed to sing there, you know, and everything that's transpired since then.
And she does eventually go and sing there. And that just goes to show her character as well. In I want to say early 40s, it's when the war is going on. She goes to do like a benefit concert, and, you know, people asked her, like, what do you mean you're going to go back and sing there, when, like, the idea of they were so mean to you. And she was like, "Hey, I'm singing, I'm doing this for a good cause." She's amazing. She lived to be in her early 90s, and you know, was the first African American at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And if you don't know much about her, she's a really fascinating character. And there is a lot of video snippets you can find of her. Yeah, really fun.
And one of the things that is also kind of an interesting twist to sort of you know, talk about within this concert is this, as you can see with the microphones, there is also being broadcasted over the airways. And there was this very impressionable young man who happened to be listening to the Marian Anderson concert. Does anybody want to take a guess who that might have been?
A guess of MLK.
Yeah, very good.
A couple of guesses of MLK.
Yeah, so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was listening to that. And a few years later, he'll actually write an essay for a contest that he talks about Marian Anderson, and he talks about this concert. And then he also talks about this idea that afterwards she struggles to find a hotel that will allow her to stay there. And so, you know, it's a great story. There's a lot of connections. And Marian Anderson will be on site on August 28th, 1963. There's this great story that she kind of gets caught in the crowd. She was supposed to, I believe, sing the national anthem to sort of kick off.
She's on the program. Yeah, she's on the
event.
program.
But she doesn't get there in time, so she has to sing a little bit later. And we've always wondered whether or not she and Dr. King ever had an opportunity to have a conversation, a discussion about her 1939 concert. We hope they did. And we're still looking for any, you know, information that can tell us whether or not that happened. But, you know, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, obviously one of the larger events that, you know, have happened here at the Lincoln Memorial. You know, hundreds, thousands of people gather for this very, you know, hot event. And this was a great example of a very, very well organized event. This was a permitted activity, if you can believe that. So a permit was issued to the organizers of this march. And they really wanted it to be a success. And so one of the things that they decided to do was put out these program guides that would be sent to anyone that was coming in to take part in this, of where to park, and of the signs to carry and what you should bring with you and what you shouldn't bring with you. And so they recognized how important this was, because the whole idea was to really not only raise awareness, but to convince Congress to pass laws that would, eventually provide rights to jobs and freedoms, and to fight against discrimination and that. So a lot of times I think we think that some of these marches and some of these protests were just kind of spur of the moment things, but this is a great example of one that not only was very successful, but also very, very well organized and very, very well planned. And if you ever find yourself at the Lincoln Memorial today, you can stand on the spot where Dr. King stood, where Marian Anderson sang, and sort of look out onto this historic view shed and just kind of close your eyes. And not only imagine being there that day, but imagine kind of what your dream, not only for the country, but for the world would be. And this is something that we often have students do when we bring them to the Lincoln Memorial. It's a very powerful experience. And one of the things that we often talk about, and I think maybe we even mentioned at the beginning, is that one of the things that we often say at the Lincoln Memorial is this idea of this unfinished work. And one of the great questions that you could ask students is, why come to the Lincoln Memorial in the first place? Why not have this march at the Capitol building or in front of the White House? Why come to Lincoln? What was it about this memorial? And quite often you'll get, there's a lot of space, and that was true. But there's also some very symbolic, sort of meaning of finishing this unfinished work. And it's still something that's definitely ongoing today. So again, another example of how some of these events kind of transform the meaning, add another layer of history to the story, as I think somebody said a little bit earlier, with these very, very historic places. So there are a couple of other events that we wanted to just sort of very quickly sort of run through, something that you could kind of present to your students. One of those is the Bonus Army of 1932. This was a little bit of a different kind of demonstration. The whole idea behind this is that World War I veterans were promised a bonus that would be paid to them in 1945. Well, when the Great Depression hit, these veterans needed that money now. And so the idea is that they would come to the nation's capital and to convince Congress to pass legislation that would change the date from 1945 to almost immediately, and so that they would be able to take care of themselves and their families. When they get there, they form these sort of encampments, and they're kind of scattered throughout Washington, D.C. There's one by the Capitol, there's one in Anacostia. There are some that actually take place in some of the abandoned buildings in Washington. And the whole idea is that they would essentially create these little towns, and they would stay there until they were able to achieve change or to convince Congress to help them out. You can see here they are sleeping at the foot of the Capitol building. Again, they have these little towns that are going to be created everywhere. They gather at the foot of the Capitol en masse to try and convince Congress to pay them what they're owed. Unfortunately, it's not as successful as some of the other events. Ultimately, what would happen is that the army is sort of sent in to clear out some of these camps, and the one in Anacostia catches fire, and eventually it's going to be destroyed. And so bonus army, these encampments aren't necessarily all that successful. But again, it's another sort of way of presenting to students, sort of another way of trying to achieve change there, through presenting, different ideas to Congress. And then another one that I think is very important, and relates very much back to the National Mall itself. Is anybody familiar with Resurrection City? What sort of happened in 1968?
Or the Poor People's
Or
Campaign.
the Poor People's Campaign, yes. Yeah. So This was an idea that was actually started with Dr. King. He had planned to come back here to Washington and to bring people with him. And whereas the March on Washington in many ways was a very organized event, this was supposed to be a little bit different. They wanted to raise public awareness about the poorer members of society and what laws could be passed that could help them out. And Jen, you're welcome to sort of jump in here at any time. But it's interesting that Dr. King, of course, never gets to achieve this. He is assassinated in 1968. So his friends and many of the other civil rights leaders will sort of carry out this wish for him by creating this city, which runs sort of the length of the reflecting pool. So kind of behind us here would be the Lincoln Memorial. And this is a massive city that in many ways, I believe it even had its own zip code. It had a zip code, it had a post office. It really
had
presented
childcare centers and all kinds of things. Yeah.
as this little town. But again, it's this whole idea of raising awareness. What do you notice though about the grounds?
I just read a quote from someone who was a participant there, who said it was open for like 42 days. This was set up, and it rained for 29 of them.
Yeah, so you can see how muddy the ground has become, and the conditions really start to deteriorate. And this is a town where there are a number of different groups who are going to come in and present a variety of messages and to achieve a variety of different goals. Unfortunately, as Jen said, the weather doesn't necessarily cooperate with them all that
I would
well.
argue that the leadership too, not that I'm faulting the leadership, but these guys are in mourning. They've suffered a blow. And Dr. King, this was his plan to showcase poverty, to bring it to the nation's capital, to show the leaders of the government that this was a real problem. And they can't, they can't get it all together because of just their own emotions and the conditions and how difficult an issue this is to deal with. So yeah, really, it was it's a fascinating thing to study. And yeah, I don't know, do we have any other pictures of it, or is this it? Yeah.
I think this is the last picture. Yeah.
We only have like a few more minutes. I don't know if you had other things, but I'm curious if anybody has any questions or any thoughts or comments that you want to share before we run out of time. Do you have anything else on here?
No, I
Could go on
wanted
about
to
this story, but it's really, if you don't know much about Resurrection City, there are a lot of articles and things you can find, videos and stuff. We marked the 50th anniversary a few years ago with a kind of an event out in that field, and it's one of the things that kind of irks me, but I feel like it's going to get worked on soon, that there's not even any mention of it. That we're working, I think, on a wayside, a sign that'll go out in that field that will at least explain. I mean, this is a sports field today, which is fine, but no mention of the fact that this whole event took place here, and it pretty much ends, ironically enough, with the revoking of the permit. So these folks had a permit, and it expired, and the police came in. The police came in at the end and said, we need to break it up. So it has kind of a really rough ending. And so, that's part of the whole story too. I see some stuff. The leaders of this, it fell to Ralph Abernathy. Jesse Jackson was there. The people who were running the movement with Dr. King will step up and kind of lead it within his absence. And I don't know, there's just like, I just think it was a really tough time. This was, there's riots happening in the city. It's right after. So King's assassinated in April, and this is set up in like May and June of 68. So it's still very raw what's happened. And these people are coming, as Bethany said, they brought in Native American groups, they brought in Latino groups, they brought all these groups together, and to try and get everybody on the same page Yes, the Bobby Kennedy thing, one of the most poignant images I found, which I shared once without copyright, is the fact that Bobby Kennedy's hearse drives through the circle at the Lincoln Memorial because they want to, pay their respects to the folks here. Coretta King comes on one of the last weekends that this is, or one of the days that this is happening before it wraps up. She comes and speaks at it. So there's a lot of emotion going on. And yeah, Bobby Kennedy's, for some reason, his funeral happened at night at Arlington. And so the picture of his hearse being driven through the Lincoln Circle is at night and people are bowing their heads. It's really powerful. There was a question too about permitting. How was this allowed? Why was this, what was the process? So the ban is maybe a hard word, but the no camping thing that is a situation for us here now on the mall was not a thing in 68, so they were allowed to do this. There's a whole really fascinating story too about the gentleman from the University of Maryland who designed these huts that they stayed in, and there was a whole process for building all of these. So yeah, there was the permit process that allowed them to do this and to be out there, and there were police, and that was also a problem about people who were in the city who weren't really helpful to others in the city. And so there's a lot of, kind of crime and things happening. But eventually the permit's going to get revoked, and that's when the police just come in and pretty much take everything down. And so I asked our permit people once about this whole thing and was told that soon after, I guess after this event happens, not because of this event, but afterwards, the permit rules would have been changed. Fair.
Yes.
Goodness. Well, I see that time is flying by here. Thank you so much all for your time. Bethany, thank you for your research and all your images and things that you have worked hard to put together and to tell us a compelling story. Thank you, teachers, for joining us. And if there's anything we can do for you as far as programs in the future, thank you for attending, and let us know if we can help you with anything in the future. Thank you all so much. I would like to see a part 2, more modern examples. Oh my, that. Great. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Have a great night.